Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. My name is Julia Anderson. I'm an associate at the Washington Kurdish Institute, and I'll be introducing this webinar for you here today. So as you might have read, today's webinar is part of Najmaldin Karim's webinar series, and we will be talking about Kurdish women, their struggles and victories, their importance in society, their causes they believe in, and their involvements in movements that have shaped today's society. Often, and especially by Western media, Kurdish women are depicted as brave soldiers, such that if you Google search Kurdish women, 99% of the pictures are all of soldiers. But there's much more to this than what you find on Google. For example, I once had a professor here in Italy, where I'm from, who wrote a really enlightening book on Kurdistan, considered as an invisible nation. And on the front page of his book, there was a Kurdish girl with a gun. And he told me he was extremely upset about the editor's choice because here in Italy, nobody knows about the great accomplishments and satisfactions Kurdish women brought to their societies. Of course, some of them are fighting related, but some of them are also social and cultural. And this is why I say there is much more to the Kurdish woman. And this is why this webinar is so important. Kurdish women have not only shaped society, but have also created a new vibrant, democratic, feminist model for the Kurdish community. For example, if we consider Syria, Kurdish women played a fundamental role in the creation of the bottom-up society that is special only to Rojava. And this is exactly what we will be talking about today. Kurdish women in Syria, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and also abroad, their role in the past, the present, and the future. As you might see here, we have a beautiful panel of only women. We have Professor Ozlem, we have Ava Homa, and Aviva Staten, which I thank to be here today. All three of them are experts in this field and have, through their studies, books, and activism, helped raise the cause of Kurdish women also abroad. So before we begin with the questions and with their speeches, I would like to underline that if any of you have any questions or would like to raise your hands, you can do it while the panelists are speaking, or write your question down in the Q&A section right at the bottom, and I will be taking all the questions at the end. Again, thank you all for your participation and for attending our conference, and we will begin with Professor Goner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you, Washington Kurdish Institute, for organizing this panel. It's such a timely month because actually this month is the anniversary of the assassination of Sakine Cansız and her comrades, her fellows in Paris by the Turkish intelligence agency that was never accounted for, just like the other Turkish killings of the Kurdish women. And so this month is especially a good month to talk about this. And it's also the month of a campaign that's been undertaken by Kurdish women, activism called 100 Reasons of Femicide to persecute Erdogan because of his continuous war, not only against the Kurdish populations, but especially against Kurdish women, whom, as Julia nicely put, have been pioneers of these struggles. So I will, as you said, that these guns and their popularity, I'm going to say even there's something more to the gun itself, but there's so much more beyond that as well. So I want to take us to then this dialectics of oppression of Kurdish women at the hands of these colonial states that have colonized them in the beginning of the 20th century. So while Kurdish populations were colonized under 4 different nation states, the ones that you have mentioned, the ones that have separated our communities from each other, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, they've also especially led femicidal processes against the Kurdish women. So we have this combination of patriarchal femicidal processes of the Turkish state against Kurdish women particularly. So an intersection of oppression also gives birth to an intersection of struggle that I will try to talk about by brief historical references and 3 generations of women who have been active and who have started a movement the products of which became popularized in Syria with Rojava revolution. The world came to recognize the importance of Kurdish women and their struggle, not only to create a democratic society for their own, but to give hope for Middle East, for peace in the Middle East and to the broader world, if we're thinking of radical alternatives to the current failing system of patriarchy, state dominance, and capitalism. So these women stay at the center. So what I'll try to do is to look at then the background of Kurdish women and their struggle with the cases that I'm most familiar with. I've done my research mostly within the borders of Turkey, within Bakur, Kurdistan, we should say. And so I'm going to take us back to an earlier massacre in the Turkish history and the way that the Turkish state oppressed Kurdish women especially, and though the Kurdish women's resilience and struggle that was born out of this double oppression. So this is 1938, the massacres in Dersim, which is in the boundaries of Turkish state. So the colonial state of Turkey have undertaken a huge genocide in the eastern Turkey, northwestern Kurdistan, called Dersim, killing thousands of people and forcing thousands more to move out of the town. And these massacres were part of a genocidal project to exterminate any potential opposition from this Kurdish, Alevi, and also Armenian residents of Dersim. And so this is also important to, by us speaking about Kurdish women, to also break that that is singular definition of an essential Kurdish woman, because as we know, there's a multiplicity, diversity in the group of women that we're talking about, which only makes the struggles of these women towards a more democratic society more prominent. So this particular town is also an Alevi town, which was also a religious minority among the Turkish state and among the Kurds also. And so what is important here, just like in any form of genocidal state violence that you look at, is that this isn't only a genocide against the Kurdish populations, but a particular one, a specific one that's targeting women in this society in different ways. So we have sexual gendered violence that the Turkish state have used against the Kurdish Alevi women of this town. And so be by means of rape, by means of sexual violence, by means of assimilation, by means of forced adoption of the young girls at the hands of the Turkish military. It was a complete genocidal and femicidal project of extermination against the Kurdish women of this particular region in 1938. So this is the first generation also of women who have struggled and who have resisted Turkish oppression by bare means of survival. And I'm going to say survival under the means of the colonial exterminatory policies of this Turkish state. Survival itself becomes a struggle and becomes resistance against this particular genocidal violence of the early 1930s, early formation of the Turkish nation state, which oppressed and exterminated all forms of resistance, be it religious, be it ethnic. So that made the Kurdish women at the bottom of this hierarchy. So we have to see this intersectional violence against Kurdish communities, but also against the Kurdish women, and in this case, Kurdish Alevi women, whom to the state were not, to survive. And so their survival was a form of resistance as early as the 1930s and 1940s. But it wasn't only their survival, it was another process that these women were involved in. So despite tens of thousands of people being killed, the massacres in Dersim have been hidden, secret from the Turkish population, and even the Kurdish population didn't have extensive knowledge of it until very recently, where oral history memory projects like mine, but also many, many others, have tried to look into memories of state violence by the Kurdish populations. And interestingly, those who remembered and those who transferred these stories of massacre and oppression were mostly the women. Men were more resistant to share. Men kept it more quiet. Men also, this is because of, you know, this patriarchal society. So it's not the femicide at the hands of the Turkish state, but as we know, the societies themselves were also patriarchal. So women weren't only oppressed at the hands of the state, but also within their own societies, they had to struggle for their own survival and freedom. So in this, and men of, you know, Dersim doing their military duty by the state, getting more of the state education, learning the language of Turkish, were more hesitant to talk about these early massacres. So in this sense, this is very interesting to me, and actually even emotional, that Sakine Cansız, and one of the pioneers that I'm going to talk about next as the second generation of women and their resistance in Bakur, refers to her grandmother's narratives of 1938 massacres as ones that radicalized her, as ones that gave her clues about the oppression of the state, because people in their attempts, the older generation, in their attempts to protect the newer generations and to make sure that they don't get punished at the hands of the state the ways that they did, tried not to communicate these memories of massacres, these memories of genocidal and femicidal processes against them by the state. But women did. They talked in their fractured stories, they talked in their songs, they talked in coming up with narratives of not only what happened to them, but giving this broader, generalized historical consciousness of oppression at the hands of the state. And this got mobilized. So this is very important for me, you know, to not see them only as the ones with the guns, but to also not see them only as the victims of oppression, but as agents of struggle. Even in their brief tellings and fractured stories and songs of these massacres, they were able to transfer both the language of Kurdish, and in this case, in my region, it was the Zazaki Kurdish. So, you know, when you speak with these women, even on a daily basis, they start telling you about what they call Akimadi, which means all that we sow, all that we sow. And if you know, go into it in detail, it becomes all that we sow at the hands of the Turkish state. So then you have this narratives, these memories, these stories, these songs, these genres of memories of oppression that were transferred to the newer generations, and then hence were mobilized into embodied forms of struggle to the next generation. And so the next generation, one of the most important figures of the next generation was Sakine Cansız, who was one of the founders of the Kurdish Workers' Party, known as the PKK. And she became involved in this in the 1970s. So in the early formation on, she has become a central figure in pushing for not only the Kurds' rights of self-determination, but of freedom understood as women's freedom as well. So earlier on, from late 1970s, which became especially important in 1980 during her struggle in the infamous Diyarbakir prisons, because the Turkish state becomes once again repressive, oppressive against not only the Turkish left in 1980 with the coup d'etat that the Turkish state had undertaken against all forms of oppression, but this is something often missed when Human Rights Watch and places like this look at Turkey and it is human rights violations. They fail to pay attention to how this becomes especially genocidal and femicidal against the Kurdish women. And so in 1980, in the infamous Diyarbakir prisons, which were in Bakur, so this is this place that the Turkish state showed its face of oppression most clearly to especially women, because dehumanizing them was what the state tried to do by, again, sexual violence, by means of, making women naked and giving them all sorts of torture to dehumanize them and to shame them. And this is something that the Turkish state and all genocidal states have done, is to use sexual violence as a form of dehumanization and putting the shame of its own violence on the oppressed women. But there was a big resistance against this among the Kurdish women in the Diyarbakir prisons. So the second generation of women starting to become active in the 1970s and 1980s have formed the earlier moments of Kurdish women's movement to resist not only against the oppressive state, but against patriarchal forms and understandings and power relations of their movements themselves. So they hence wanted to revolutionize and started to develop a theory and practice of revolution that would end up freeing not only the Kurdish societies, but Kurdish women and women in general. So, and their struggle grew stronger, and the movements, their exchanges, for example, between Öcalan, the founder of the PKK, and Sakine Cansız during this period, where it was recognized that women in the Diyarbakir prisons were the only, for example, cell that never opened up to state, never gave any names to the state. So this became a very interesting moment of resistance to prove Kurdish women's resilience against these oppressive forces, which gives them dominance and start to have their own voice within the movement that was supported by Öcalan as well, which became an important aspect of the success, but also, it's one of the aspects among, most importantly, women's own struggle in prisons, in the broader society to revolutionize not only against the Turkish state, but to revolutionize their own movements. And so when you then approach, right, 1970s and 80s, we speak about the second generation. And then in the 1990s, the Kurdish movement increasingly grows in Bakur. So the PKK is growing, there's increasing sympathy, and this is all because also of the dialectics of oppression and resistance that the 1980s, the Kurdish populations faced extreme state violence at the hands of the state due to the coup. And then 1990s, against the PKK, they supposedly, named it as a terrorist organization, and they terrorized the whole Kurdish populations during this period, criminalizing them for just living and surviving in their own villages, saying that you are helping the PKK. And during this period, state terror against the Kurdish villages intensified in Turkey. But once again, dialectically, it gave birth to an increased momentum to the Kurdish freedom movement and an increased momentum to women who were once again living under excessive military occupation, were under the threat of not only violence because they are Kurds, but under the oppression of gendered state, femicidal violence at the hands of the Turkish state, and they found salvation in the mountains. So this is very important for the Kurdish movement. This is the third generation. In the 1990s, Kurdish women increasingly participated in the PKK, in the freedom movement, but also they were leading a parallel freedom movement within their own movement. And we see the products of this coming out, especially in the 1990s, in the multiplication of organizations within the Kurdish freedom movement that are all women's organizations. And this becomes very central to what we see, in Rojava today and in the freedom struggle that became most popularized. But I think it's important to recognize that these started in the 1990s. And we saw, for example, there's a resolution in 1995 within the PKK, where the PKK declared, called this resolution concerning the women's army and the free women's movement, which states the potential of women who make up half of the society in the service of the revolution, and their hidden and suppressed talents and intelligence in creating an entire society based on equality is the most humane and the most radical characteristic of our revolution. So this is 1995. And this resolution would grant independence to women's organizations and opens the way to all women units relative power, and they have relative power over the all gender units. So this is as early as 95, we see a very dramatic move, a success, a revolution of women that wasn't attained in other freedom movements around the world. And I'm not just talking about the Middle East, but I'm talking about broader European, US. We don't see a similar, I mean, there are similar movements, you know, there are notions of intersectionality. There's a very strong Black women's movements that has many parallels of intersectionality. But in terms of accessing their struggle resulting in these all women's units becomes a very exceptional and unique development that develops in the PKK as early as 1995. Now, there's obviously resistance, right, by not only the Turkish state, which is already naming this quite radically free movement as a terrorist organization, but also there is resistance by the man within the PKK itself, and there is, power holders and holders of patriarchy, but women's struggle and Öcalan's support at that point also has become very important in the continuing success and continuing developments that, leads to a multiplication of women's organizations, women's units, all women independent organizations within the Kurdish freedom movement all over Bakur and also in diaspora as well. So we have Kurdish women being very active in the pro-Kurdish political party. You have, nowadays known as HDP, obviously was closed down and targeted a number of times and have gotten opened in different names. I know I don't have much time, but I'm going to end with this. And I know Aviva is going to talk about Rojava, and so how this whole freedom movement is kind of like a background to the revolution that we have celebrated in Rojava. But the important thing is that these three generations of women, the 1930s, the resistance, the resilience, the survival, the speaking of the language, the memories that they transfer, that then gets mobilized in the movements of the 1970s and 80s. And then, within the PKK, they end up in the 1990s with women increasingly joining the guerrilla, but also the political party. They become pioneers of Saturday mothers. So they also point to these forms of gendered violence that the colonial states have been conducting in the region. So you have peace mothers pushing for peace process in Turkey. So you see women of all ages, of all generations, of all political experience and education being involved in a freedom movement with the motto, if a society pushes you to the bottom, not as Kurds only, but as Kurdish women, then the only way to come out of that is to revolutionize the whole society. And I'm going to end with this by saying that the freedom movement that the Kurdish women created, starting in Bakur and expanding, enlarging, has also important lessons for the feminist movement, in the world. And I'm situated, for example, in the US, and, the solidarity work between different feminist movements, that there's an important lesson that as early as 1990s is that women cannot be free just based on a struggle based on gender. In other words, gender equality is not possible in an otherwise unequal world. So in order to, become free, that you need to destroy all forms of oppression that at the time were targeting the Kurdish women. be it the nation state, be it patriarchy, and be it capitalism as well, because the majority of these women are also farmers, workers, and agriculture workers, and also, so there's a class dimension to this. So there developed a vanguard of revolution, a vanguard of political notion of understanding of freedom that says women are the agents of freedom, but not only freedom from patriarchy, but freedom from the nation state and freedom from capitalist structures of oppression as well. So I'm gonna leave it at that, and sorry for taking more time than I was assigned, and thank you.
Thank you. It was really interesting. You made really interesting points on the role of women, especially in Turkey. Thank you again, and I will now give the word to Ava Homa. Thank you.
I would like to start by thanking Washington Kurdish Institute, the organizers, the moderator, my fellow panelists. Ozlem, that was very moving, very enlightening. Thank you so much. And thanks to you for attending this session. And I would like to start by talking about the fact that two contradictory images of Kurdish women float in both Iranian media and international media. On one hand, Kurdish women are the unveiled women of the Middle East that put on colorful dresses, they dance hand in hand with men, they comfortably associate with men at work, at home, family. But on the other side of the spectrum, Kurdish women have been battered and even killed in the name of honor. They've been victims of FGM, and most strikingly, specifically within the Iranian border, we have alarmingly high rates of suicides by Kurdish women. A lot of it is self-immolation. Suicide in itself is a huge cry for help, but using fire to do that is a whole different level of screaming how unjust and unfair the situation is. But to understand this paradox, both sides of the spectrum, it's important to look at the historical context. So no matter which country the Kurds have found themselves in, we've always been perceived and understood not as human, but as threats to not territorial integrity, threats to dictatorship and all of that. So we have been reduced to risks and threats and subhumans. And so in order we have been dealt with through annihilation, through elimination, and that can be gassing, in Iran, arbitrary detentions, executions, a lot of executions, all in the name of what they call moharebe, enmity against God, which is a completely make-believe charge. And worse than that, though, the idea of assimilation, where they destroy your language and culture and your identity, and what they allow of you is more of a shell of a human than someone who understands who they are and where they come from and what they're fighting for. But despite the borders that have separated Kurds across these different countries, it's important to understand that our common language and culture, but also most importantly, the tragedies that we go through specifically because of our ethnicity, has created really deep bonds between women, Kurdish women, regardless of which city they live in. So I grew up in Sanandaj or Sna, the Iranian part of Kurdistan, but what happens in Diyarbakir to women in Diyarbakir, to women in Kobani affects me as much, if not more, than what the decisions that are made in Tehran. So understanding that affinity is very important in understanding Kurdish women's situation in general. In terms of rulers and governors, Western travelers have always marveled at the fact that Kurdish people were the only people who had women as rulers and governors, when Turkish and Persian, their Turkish and Persian neighbors had never heard of such a thing. In fact, it was so common for Kurdish women to become rulers and governors that in Shahrazad, in Qanunnama, it is mentioned. Now, I'm not trying to say this idea exactly matches our today's idea of feminism, where women are seen as independent individuals. These were powerful, wealthy women who were married to or were born into wealthy, powerful families, but it's still, for the time, it was unheard of. If you look at history in Kurdistan, again, in Rojava, we have had a lot of examples of powerful women. One of them is Adela Khatun, who created her own court of justice after she married Osman Pasha and moved to Halabja, and she exercised her own influence over that until her death. in 1924. In Bashur in 1920, Hafsa Khan was one of the powerful women who greatly emphasized on women literacy and fought for it. So where we are today and what we have achieved, as Ozlem pointed out, we really stand on the shoulder of giants, and it's been generations of resistance and fight that got us here today. Even though the first women organization was established in Istanbul in 1919, imagine 1919, American women got the right to vote only 100 years ago, and that included only white women. Black women and Latinos so much longer. But in 1919, Kurds had the first women organization. In fact, in 1946, when we had Mahabad Republic or Kurdistan Republic in Rojava, Chapter 4 of Article 21 of Constitution specifically stated that Kurdish women should enjoy equal rights in all political, economic, and social affairs. And 2 of the 16 leaders who spoke on that day were women. And their names was Khadija Siddiqui and Ismet Qazi. And both of them called for women's education. So that's our history in terms of present-day Iranian Kurdistan. As it was obviously mentioned, in Iran, the laws are specifically misogynistic, and those laws have affected women of all different ethnic groups, regardless of their religion, their class, or their sexual orientation. But obviously, oppression is multi-layered. So even though no woman in Iran can get married, get divorced, have custody of their children without a male permission, be it that their father or their husband, they can't travel or even leave the country without the husband's permission. For most cases, there are some exceptional cases, but in general, women are obviously treated as subhumans because you can't make simple, small decisions about your own jobs and traveling without having the men's consent. But on the other hand, Kurdish women have experienced a variety of levels of oppression. So the national chauvinism of the ruling state, the male chauvinism of the ruling state and our own culture, the misogyny of Islamic groups, and the continuing war. In Rojava, we have a lot of economic problem. Poverty is a huge issue, unemployment. And then outside of Rojava, our statelessness means we have been ignored in both, ignored and excluded in both Middle Eastern studies and Western studies. Today, in Kurdish Women of Iran, we have really strong and extremely amazing, inspiring activists and feminists who have done a lot of work, and they have been successful in cutting down on things like FGM and honor killing. They have been successful at raising awareness, but we cannot mention their names because their lives can be at risk. So they have to stay anonymous for their own safety, at least for now. And in my work, my focus is mostly on suicide prevention. I have worked with both spectrum of the women that I mentioned. First of all, those women who are risking their lives, risking their family's safety in order to be able to work against these oppressions. And on the other hand, the devastated women's attempted suicide. And every time I look at these women and hear their stories and the extreme pressure and pain that they go through, I keep telling myself that if they were somewhere else, if they were in Kobani today, their situation would be different. So instead of turning on against themselves, they would be able to turn on all this oppression against their oppressors. Another problem in Iran has a lot of strong women, has a very strong feminist group, but unfortunately the mainstream feminists are extremely ethnocentric. So they're not capable of understanding the intersectionality. They're afraid of diversity, and they do not acknowledge that Kurdish women Kurds in general as a nation have legitimate rights, and therefore the ethnically oppressive policies of the government that affects Kurdish women for their gender as well as their ethnicity is completely denied and overlooked by the mainstream feminists. Obviously, there are exceptions to that, but in general, feminists who are afraid of admitting the national rights of the Kurds, they have become unwitting agents of patriarchy themselves by denying the pressure and oppression that Kurdish women bear because of their ethnicity. When it comes to my own personal experience and work, as I mentioned, I work with activists to hold suicide prevention workshop. Like I said, this is the loudest cry for help. This is the loudest protest, but it is also the biggest sign of how unhealthy the Iranian society is. And when it comes to my writing and literature, I write about both groups of women. In fact, my protagonist in my novel, Daughters of Smoke and Fire, Layla, is a woman who starts by believing that her life is not worth living and that there is no way out of oppression except through ending it. And she ends up becoming an artist and a filmmaker. So she is a person who goes through this entire spectrum. As a child, when I was coming of age, I understood what Ozlem pointed out, that on one hand, yes, I belong to unpeople. I belong to people who have been subjected for annihilation repeatedly. But on the other hand, just being alive, just breathing was subversion in itself, because there are so many forces at hand trying to take away even their right to breathe from you. So I grew up with this hushed stories. They were hushed stories. They wouldn't be said out loud because this was our parents' and grandparents' idea of protecting us. But you hear these hushed stories of massacre, how the soldiers came for us, how we survived them, how they came to kill us, how they came to more than kill us, how they torched our villages, raped our women, shot our father before the white eyes of their children, and so much more. The problem is those of us who survived the physical erasure, and in Iran, physical erasure has not been as prominent as cultural erasure. And the states that ruled over us in Iran, Kurds are denied. You're just Iranian. You don't have an independence identity. And if you do, then we were labeled mufsid fil ars. That's what Khomeini called us, the corruptors on earth. And obviously, anyone who fights back is labeled a terrorist. So state terrorism is completely accepted. Resisting it is not. And as Kurdish parents try to protect their children under the assimilate or annihilate policy, we gradually lost part of our heritage and developed this cognitive dissonance between the generations, where a grandchild may not be able to really communicate with their grandparents because of having lost their language. So our language and history were banned, our pain was ridiculed and used against us, we were denied, we were defined by our oppressors, reduced to subhumans. But I want to end on this note that in spite of, or maybe exactly because of all this, we became masters of rising from our own ashes. And the fact that Bar Khodan Jiana, resistance is life, is our motto, is not just a pretty thing to say. It's actually literally what all of us have done, including the women here, the three of us who are working with you. We have seen the end of the world a few times before. And so my life work stands on this empowering intersection of literature and activism. I believe in the power of stories to evoke compassion and understanding. And I believe that with a little bit of guidance, that compassion can be turned into action. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ava. Your words were really touching. And I see your books on the background as well. It's on my bookshelf behind here. And I'm going to read it really soon. Thank you again. And Aviva, it's for you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I want to start by also thanking Washington Kurdish Institute and Julia, our moderator, my fellow panelists, and also the listeners. I also am not Kurdish myself, so I speak only on behalf of myself and the work that I've done with the Kurdish movement. But of course, these are not my historical experiences, and I would not name them as such. But I do think it is so important, and I'm so glad that Ozlem and Ava both gave such a historical background and a strong foundation for understanding where we are now in the struggle and in the movement, especially in Rojava, which is what I will focus on in Syria and Kurdistan. And this democratic, radical feminist model that has been developed for generations. And when you look at the historical context in Syria as well, Kurdish people have faced severe oppression under the Assad regime, both Bashar al-Assad and Hafez al-Assad, over the course of many, many years. And the Rojava region was and still is the breadbasket of Syria, but this was exploited, and the Kurdish people were oppressed in such a way that they were not even able to reap the benefits of the fact that they were the ones creating the wealth for the country. Everything was taken from them, and they had to rebuy all of the finished products after being manufactured in other parts of Syria. So from a very, very early age, also, Kurdish was banned in schools. The culture was severely oppressed, and a very strong policy of Arabization was enforced. So you had this erasure on multiple levels of cultural and economic, and also gender, of course, because when you remove these avenues of opportunity and prosperity, you also reinforce these cultural norms of the inability to express oneself, the inability to share struggle, and it creates divisiveness and even more oppression that becomes manifest within a culture. And thus you see much stronger elements of patriarchy emerging as well that also limit what women are able to do in society and allowed to do in society. But now, of course, in Rojava, we see something very, very different. And we see that they have built these systems that allow for a much more equal society. And they are based on these ideals and the ideologies that were developed in Turkey, in Rojava, in Bakur, over the course of many decades and generations. And as Ozlem said, these ideologies were developed by eventually what became the PKK under Abdullah Öcalan and his contemporaries, including Sakina Censiz. And because of the colonialist structure and the way that Kurdistan was originally broken down, families were separated along borders. And so the borders between the different parts of Kurdistan have historically always been very porous. And so with the flow of people, you also had a very strong flow of ideas. And so these ideas and these systems and parallel societies were brought into Rojava as well, and really created a shadow system underneath the oppressive state that allowed people to create shadow societies and shadow civil societies that created avenues for women to share their histories, share their skills, share their stories, and make sure that their culture was not lost, that their language was not lost. And eventually, of course, this led to what we see now. And I would like to focus on the implementation of the system now in Rojava, which is known as democratic confederalism. And the ideology and the system is based on four main elements, which are gender equality, self-defense, multiculturalism, and social ecology. And there is an understanding that these elements cannot exist on their own fully. It is an intersectional approach. And when it comes to gender equality specifically, you have many different elements that have been incorporated into governance and administrative structures that ensure that the traditions and patriarchal cultures cannot remove them again. So every government council, and this is a bottom-up system, so you have local village councils, you have communes, you have further up government councils, and then at the top the autonomous administration of North and East Syria. And every council and body is headed by two democratically elected co-chairs, one man and one woman. There are 40% quotas in each representational body that are reserved for women, and not just Kurdish women, because of course Rojava is a very multicultural environment. So these are reserved also for Arab women, for Yazidi women, for Turkmen, Assyrian, Syriac women. And so these are systems that have been put into place to ensure that women will always have a voice and will always be able to participate and make their needs and their wants known, and that they no longer have to do it in this hushed way of passing down memories, but that they are able to really voice their opinions very, very vocally. There are also special women's organizations under the umbrella of Congress Star, which is the sister to Tevdem, the umbrella of civil society in Rojava. And Congress Star is the Congress of the Women's Movement, first established in 2004. It was Yakutia Star then. And while it was originally an underground movement that was designed to combat the dominance of the Ba'athist regime, it has since emerged operating on the basis of confederalism, and it has various organizations, committees, and unions that participate to develop a free and democratic Syria, beginning with Rojava. And these congresses, these organizations and unions, these are all women's organizations. They represent the needs, and they are only for women. So they also address issues like domestic violence. They provide malajin, women's houses, where women can go if they feel unsafe. And they are also the overarching umbrella of Jinwar, the women's village, which is a village that has been created of, I think, 30 houses only for women. And this village acts as a commune where women can live in safety and harmony. They grow their own produce, which also is a means of resisting the traditional form of oppression of disconnecting women from the earth. And so they're able to grow their own produce, sell, and sustain themselves in this way. And this really aims to combine the elements of democracy, ecology, and women's liberation. And this comes back to the focus on sustainability that is also core to the intersectional approach of democratic confederalism. Of course, this is not to say that there aren't challenges. There are. The patriarchy and the traditional gender norms in culture in the region are very, very strong, and they do have a long history. However, education is also a core element of the changes that have been happening throughout the revolution in Rojava. And academies have been created that allow for both men and women to attend in order to understand the elements of democratic confederalism and the benefits that they bring to both men and women. Because when you look at feminism, when you look at intersectionality, and when you look at patriarchy and toxic masculinity, these are things that affect men and women. Men are also very negatively impacted by the effects of patriarchy and toxic masculinity. They're not able to express emotion. They're not able to, many times in oppressed societies, feel as though they are able to provide for their families. They're not able to fulfill the role of being a man. But these toxic systems that have been inherently integrated into the culture, they are not they're not part of this new system in many ways. And so these academies serve to educate the entire society on how breaking down the patriarchy is beneficial to everyone. In the same way that breaking down capitalism and class systems is beneficial to everyone. It allows economic independence, it allows political participation, and it allows an equal sharing of life in general and participation in society. I know we don't have a lot more time, so I don't want to go too long. But I also wanted to touch on the way that women, Kurdish women, are perceived by Western media, especially living in the Netherlands and being from the US. You see so many of these images of women holding guns, and especially in Rojava with the advent of the revolution and the role that Kurdish women and Kurds in general have played in the fight against the Islamic State, Daesh. They have been built up on this pedestal by Western media, but in a way that they are focused on as beautiful fighters, flashy headlines, always focused on the conflict. And Kurdish women and women in general, they're still being reduced to objects. We are still either sexualized or infantilized. We are not given agency. And this is something that the Rojava Revolution is really about, is restoring agency to women. in a way that women have reclaimed. And reclaiming the means of actually living their lives in the way that they desire, and not being reduced to an objectified thing. And this is something that I see Western media really struggling with, to understand fully the role of Kurdish women in the YPG and the YPJ. The YPJ is the women's protection units. It is the women's wing of the military. And it is not only Kurdish women. There are Arab women that fight as well, also women from other ethnic groups, because multiculturalism and inclusivity is also a key element of democratic confederalism and building a society that can exist and coexist in peace and tolerance. And one other element that I would like to touch on as well, as far as Western media goes, is also the controversial but I find very important contentious issue of the YPJ, in particular, accepting girls under the age of 18. And this is something that is reamed in media. It's recruiting children into the military. It's child soldiers. It's child labor. But this fails to understand the complexity of the situation. This inflexible Western perspective, it fails to understand that youth recruitment isn't necessarily youth recruitment. It is giving women an opportunity to leave a family, perhaps, that wants to marry them at an early age. So many women are still trapped in these patriarchal and cultural vices. As Ava said, FGM is still a very, very common problem in this part of the world. So I would like to just emphasize that also, women are not directly joining the military. They are being given education. They are learning skills. They are working in other aspects as well. There's a lot of administrative services. There are the Malajins, the other organizations under Congress Star. And so these opportunities provide women with avenues towards success, towards learning skills, towards economic independence, towards understanding a greater role in society. And as they're given these opportunities and these freedoms, they are also more free to participate in political life as well as social life. And that is so unbelievably important in creating a free society that truly understands the contributions of women and the talent and possibilities that women bring to the table. And so I'd like to finish with that. And thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. And as an American living abroad, I really agree on your point on how Western media depicts women from Kurdistan. Now, we have many questions. Some of them were sent out by email. Some of them are in the Q&A, and there's also one with the hand raised. So given we would like to try to finish by 1:15 maximum, I really ask you to keep your questions short. So, ask them really briefly. And I'm going to leave Aviva, Dr. Goner, and Ava understand which questions are better to answer. So I'm going to begin with one with the raised hand. So Niman Gafuri, I will unmute your microphone. I think you can ask your question now. No, not really.
Hi, everybody. Great talk from all of you. As I wrote in the message, I didn't know that actually I had raised hand, but never mind. You see, we have an internal issue that nobody has been, touching or discussing. And this is the division that women has started against each other. I gave you the example, both in Bakur and in Rojava. Just a simple example, you go to a funeral, if you are a fighter or a political active woman, then you are allowed to participate in the male's section of funeral. But if you are a housewife or a mother or non-politically active, you are another class. You are below the other group of the women, and you are not allowed to enter the same free communication, free society. And it's exactly similar to what is happening in Bashur and Rojava. If you are going back from abroad, or if you are someone else's daughter who is very active, then the Kurdish men are proud of you, and you can sit with him, you can drink, eat, but not their own daughters, not their own wives, not their own sisters. And these, I think, in Kurdistan, in all four parts, are generally, being smuggled in, that we have two classes of women, and we are leaving behind our mothers who are cooking, washing, and taking care. And I put the question, I don't think many people are aware that Yazidi women, after being rescued, after being sold so many times, after being raped so many times, just because they have given birth to a child, they are not allowed to keep the child. And despite all the progress that we have in Rojava, they are putting these women by force in house arrest because they don't want to separate from their children. And they have separated so many women by hidden force, because they have been fooling them, they've been lying to them. If you leave your child in this orphanage, you can come back, you can visit them, and this never happens. So these mothers have been separated for 2 years from their children, and the other women have been, the longest is 2 years and 2 months, and the youngest is 2 months, that they have been in house arrest, and they don't have any voice whatsoever. So where is the power of the women that we are talking for, the most vulnerable women in our society? Thank you.
I may say a word on that.
Thank you.
Yes, of course, I completely understand this. And this is something that, the activist women, those who could have leading positions, the ones that you mentioned, which by means of entering politics, you kind of have a privileged position in the, but we have many conversations. And the important thing that I, think is, it's sad, but I always hear this, that it is a struggle. It's a constant struggle to revolutionize, to change. So it never ends, and no one, here, I think, claims that Kurdish women are free. There's no such thing. It is a constant struggle to make change in society. And so you are so right that it starts with those who are active in the movement, because movement sets in organizational spaces that makes sure that there's all women units that can, for example, give punishments of sorts to men who want to keep these patriarchal roles within their party or organization. So they can, for example, kick a man who is married, twice out of the party, because they are part of the party, that women can have resolutions and consequences of those men within their organizations that practice gendered patriarchal practices. But you're right that the society itself, there's still a long way of revolutionizing, of struggle. And this is, someone I spoke with actually in Rojava, one of the women founders of Congress Star. And she said that, we cannot stop a second in our fight for freedom, because we know that women are not free. So there is the idea of how you can, constantly struggle to make changes and to form organizations. For example, there's Women's Asayish, the organizations that Aviva mentioned, that if a woman calls, women's calls are the ones that to be addressed right away. So they try to put in mechanisms and organizations such as Women's Asayish, such as, Malajins, such as women's peace committees, to then settle these kinds of issues in freeing these women who have applied to them. But there's a long way to go to form more of these, and to transform the society that, just like any other male dominant patriarchal society, are trying to hold on to their patriarchal power positions. So there's definitely that reality that we're dealing with, but to keep it short, there is the hope that as the movement grows, and also there's, they can't impose these on certain societies. As Aviva mentioned, it's a multicultural society. So for example, there's some Arab men who want to hold on to their patriarchal positions and don't want the Kurdish movement to have any questioning of, and that would be right, like a higher up top to bottom process, which Rojava doesn't want to replicate. If they, for example, put banning on that to Arabs, then there wouldn't be, cooperation. So the idea is to how to revolutionize and how to give the women themselves, right? The Arab women in that case, the means to join education, to join these organizations, then they would create their own revolution in revolutionizing their societies. So I always hear this, and it's sad because I want it to happen today. I don't want to see it, wait for it. But there is the idea that revolutionizing and struggle for freedom is a constant struggle that's happening on the way, but we cannot say, right, Kurdish women are free. We can say they are giving a very important struggle in the way of freedom of women.
Very briefly, just to build on that, I have learned in my journey that there are 3 fights that I'm fighting the whole time. One is fighting against the obvious oppressor outside, and that's perhaps the easiest fight, right? And then there is this fighting the imperfections within your own people, within your own allies, within people who are working with you. And the third, and perhaps the hardest fight, is understanding the imperfections and problems within yourself and trying to resolve them. And do all of that not with anger, but with kindness. That's really where our battles lie. So.
Thank you. I hope, Niman, your question was answered. So we have many questions in the Q&A. We're going to let's try to do them all if we can, or else, I'm sorry, but it's time limited. And one of the questions that, again, who of you would like to answer is, how do you think that, and how often do women use social media to raise awareness on their circumstances, and on what platforms?
I mean, if I speak too much, so if anyone, there's many, there's like Congress Star of, Rojava, there is Kurdish Women Weaving Future, there is TJKE, which is the Kurdish women's, mostly based in diaspora. So there are many Twitter, there are many organizations, our own organizations, Emergency Committee for Rojava here, but so it's such a vibrant movement that there's certainly many.
Yeah, I don't think any studies has been done, so we don't have statistics, but I also agree that it keeps growing, that women in diaspora try to get together where we don't have to be limited to borders anymore, and they have created a lot of new foundations and forums to connect all the Kurds.
Absolutely. And I know from my own experiences and my own network, even on an individual level, I find that the Kurdish community is very, very active on social media in general. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, even with live feeds at protests and demonstrations in the diaspora. People are always posting and trying to raise awareness. I see most often, I think, on Facebook and Twitter. But on an individual level, yes, I would say Kurdish women are very active.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question that arrived via email. How do you believe that Kurdish women can play a role in the Kurdish unity between all parts of Kurdistan?
I think the question of gender oppression is really unifying, because, say, I give the example of like a woman in Soleimani's situation, a woman in Tehran's situation, and my situation. I can connect to the woman in Tehran only on gender oppression. I can connect to a woman in Diyarbakir and Soleimani on gender and ethnic oppression. So I feel like even though our border realities have affected certain parts of our movement toward liberation, but women can be extremely effective in offering so much in common that the differences could be overshadowed.
Thank you. If anybody would like to.
I would just like to add that women have also historically played a hugely important role in peace talks and negotiations when it comes to cross-border issues. I think of the Troubles in the UK in the 90s and the role that women played in the negotiations and peace talks there. And they really played a incredibly important role in bringing together both sides of the table and actually making progress towards a peaceful solution. So I think that women do and can, cross-border capacity, relate to each other on a level can indeed bring together peoples across borders. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, building upon that, just also, you know, both right now in the processes that we talk about, one of the halting of the peace process in Turkey, and women have played, you know, crucial roles when this was in place. And also right now there's the Syrian peace negotiations talks, but we know that women in Rojava have not been accepted to these peace conversations. So there's, you know, they are being prevented, but at the same time, I agree with Eva that the gender oppression and the resistance against that, but also it requires, you know, political outview that, you know, it's bottom up. Women's movements are always bottom up. So this is also, you know, the idea of building movements from bottom up, connecting women from bottom up, because otherwise we know that, you know, because of the colonial reality within the broader Kurdistan, that these women have been bordered and our politics have been separated from each other. So there are different values, different political ideas that Kurdish societies, but not societies at the level of, you know, higher ups. But I think moving from the bottom, you actually can see that there is a lot of interest in building from bottom up, centering women, centering these principles for the freedom of whole societies that I hope will divide the barriers and borders politically and organizationally.
Thank you. We only have time for one last question, and then we can proceed for closing remarks. And interesting question I see in the Q&A is, how do you believe, maybe all three of you, that we can make as women and as international women, how we can have the international community change the picture and make the fate of Kurdish women recognized?
Well, if I may, I think there is a lot of building from, you know, and getting our movements be connected to the movements that are happening in the places that we live. For example, in our case, we live in these 3 different countries that have their own women's movements, their own feminist movements, their own democratic movements. Because, you know, that's another thing that cuts borders, is the forms of oppression that different societies and groups face wherever they are. So in this sense, I think building among these and making our struggles known, but making our histories known and the experiential realities of oppression, and being in constant dialogue. Because, you know, if you look at diplomatic forces, we're so bounded by the terms that are imposed on us. Like, for example, I cannot enter Turkey, or that I talk about Sakine Cansız, her picture's right behind me. And I'm now thinking, you know, will Turkish authorities ever let me to go to my own hometown? Because diplomatically, we need to change these discourses of terrorism that have named our struggles of freedom and have separated, have criminalized them diplomatically. So I think, you know, there's a lot of way to go in terms of recognizing state terror, state oppression, recognizing these forms of oppression, and also building bridges between these movements that are struggling against oppression. You know, on the other hand, you see people on the left kind of criticizing Kurdish populations because, let's say, the US, they ask for the US soldiers to remain. It's like, well, they need to survive. You know, there's no other mechanism right now to prevent us from dying, which we have been massacred, as Eva was saying. We hear each other's pain, because we have been massacred since the 1920s at the very least, in thousands and thousands at the time, in millions. Right now, everybody who's ever inspired me or I feel politically akin to is either dead or in prison. And so the state that does these are known to be a legitimate state, as opposed to the women who struggle for freedom are put in prison to be criminals or not let their countries, like my case, which I'm much more privileged than my, people who have been in the struggle and who are in the countries themselves. Right. But this is just so much building and so much understanding that requires to be done, and so much changing of the frameworks. So we push them. We don't limit ourselves to the boundaries of these discursive diplomatic formations, but to push to make a change in them as we want freedom for ourselves.
And I just want to add that art and literature play a very, very big role, because we kind of go over the politicians' head. Politicians look at their own temporary interests, and that's how they make decisions. And even though lobbying is important, it doesn't reach the hearts of the people. Whereas someone like Zara Dogan or a novel can tell our stories, put it in context, so it's not just a clip from a journal. It gives you the history, it gives you a context, and this is a heart-to-heart resuscitation, because when an everyday American picks up a novel, looks at a literary work, looks at an artwork, and understands something about Kurdish pain, it affects who they vote, it affects their ballots, it affects the letters that they send their representative, right? So it's important that we build these bridges with average citizens across the world in Europe and North America.
Absolutely. Building on that, I'd just like to add, it's so important to keep the discussions going and to keep having these talks and these conversations with people outside of our own bubbles as well, outside of our own societies, outside of our own networks, and to really reach out and share information and share stories. And it is incredibly important, of course, for Kurdish women to share their own stories when they can do so safely. But it's also unbelievably important for non-Kurdish women to support and to also share their stories and to share why it has resonated so deeply with us, because that's also a way of saying we are the same. We face the same struggles as women. We face different versions of the same histories, and we are so much more connected than top-down state oppressors would have us believe. But we truly are. So it's so important to keep having those conversations and discussions and being open with each other as well.
Thank you. Well, wrapping things up, I would like to thank everybody who attended this webinar. I would like to thank Professor Goner, Aviva, and Ava for being here today. I hope that, their speeches enlighten you all like they did to me. And I just want to make one final remark. Women have always been the center of the world and have always played an important role, maybe sometimes in the back rows, but they've always been fundamental for fighting for what the rights are and for what everybody is standing here for today. And this stated, also on behalf of the Washington Kurdish Institute, I would like to thank you all. And I hope it was extremely interesting for all of you. And thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.